welcome to the panel Animal in Legend and Fairy Tale. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Juliana Neibold. So I'm going to say a few words about her. So Juliana is currently completing a master's degree in environmental policy at the Sciences Po in Paris. Today's presentation is the thesis she submitted to her BA in Language, Literature and Culture with the subjects English, Sociology and Politics from the Justus Liebig University in Gießen. The topic of today's paper was inspired by a semester abroad in Ireland, spent at the University College Cork, and her research interests were further developed during her work as a student assistant at the Interdisciplinary Research Institute, ICAR3R, where she worked for 2 years, assisting with the literary research and editing, translation, and submission of articles on the human-animal nature relationship. In addition, she has co-translated and supported the editing of Katharina Ameli's monography, Multi-Species Ethnography, Methodology of the Holistic Research Approach of Human, Animals, Nature, and Culture. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Firstly, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to the organizers to present this today. And thank you overall to everyone for the interesting presentations and for the very friendly atmosphere at the conference. So my presentation focuses on the complex interactions between human and animal and nature actions in Irish fairy tales. And in my bachelor thesis, on which this presentation builds, I analyzed the 3 fairy tales, Fia Uska, the Salmon of Knowledge, and the Wooing of Itai. Sorry for the pronunciation, I'm not an Irish speaker, I wish I was. And using Gerda Julien's Grimer's attention model combined with Bruno Latour's action network theory, I analyzed those tales. And for this presentation, I will focus mainly on the analysis of one of the tales because of the limited time, the Salmon of Knowledge, before presenting the results of the comparative analysis of the 3. And taking an eco-narratological approach, I will highlight the interconnectedness between nature and culture, which shapes these narrative networks, and I will connect these narrative networks to the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships present in different indigenous cosmologies. And lastly, considering characteristics of the oral storytelling tradition and native science, I ask how dyslectic Irish fairy tales portray the concepts of nature and culture, and then how far they document indigenous practices of learning with and becoming with the modern human world. I'm sorry, it's a little bit heavy on sociology. So the fairy tale is considered one of the most famous and loved and influential literary genres, as also one of the oldest narrative traditions, as before it existed in its written form, orally shared fairy tales were present in nearly every culture. Fairy tales tend to pass classical genre barriers because of their continual evolution inherent to oral transmission, which characterized them. And this is especially true for Irish fairy tales, which are shown to flow seamlessly from myth to legend to history, blending various storytelling elements. Fairy tales fit the definition of an explanatory tales, as their stories try to explain the natural world of Ireland and the origin of the Irish. And Irish fairy tales are considered particularly original amongst European folk tales. And as Vito Carassi states, Ireland stands out as a nation that has managed to preserve the most conspicuous and significant traditional patrimony and the strictest relationship between it and its literary reworking. Fairy tales can also be interpreted as a narrative tradition that is documenting and conveying experiential cultural learning, as they've been molded over centuries through reciting and retelling, and have hence, and I'm quoting Stephen Jones, achieved a basic narrative form that is a distillation of human experience. Aaron James and Eric Morel highlight oral storytelling tradition as an essential medium that relies on physical proximity and engages the body in the transmission and comprehension of narratives. And because of this, they're seen as able to document a potentially dynamic relationship a culture has to a specific place or its natural environment overall. The transmission and creation of Irish fairy tale was overall inherently open access, open-end, and bottom-up in its early oral stages. And Vito Carassi also suggests that the pre-Christian and indigenous dimension of Irish society allowed for a broader range of possibilities and a deeper connection with spiritual and natural aspects of existence. And this is contrasted with limitations and barriers imposed by colonization and Christianity. In the age of modernity, the oral tradition was weakened significantly as philosophical movements and modern scientific advances questioned speculative, experiential and subjective knowledge, and the educated elite sought to establish the ideological and cultural authority through literary and scientific discourse. And Mehrdad Samadze cites this development as significant for the loss of the harmonious coexistence with nature and the individual's capability of free emotional expression. In order to examine the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships in the analyzed fairy tale, I turn to indigenous theories and native science. This will be a very brief overview because, of course, this field is huge. And I have to say at this point as well that there is limited publications on indigenous theories, primarily because many indigenous peoples have had limited access to international research and publication opportunities. And this is also connected to the hegemonic position of Western science, which internationally controls what is considered science. And of course, colonialism also played a significant role in the repression and destruction of indigenous knowledge and thought. One notable difference between Western science and native science that I want to draw your attention to is the lack of strict boundaries in native science. While Western tradition separates natural and social sciences very strictly, this separation is currently also in Western research discussed as a hindrance to science and the Anthropocene, and I will come back to this later. Native science emphasizes the observation as a fundamental element that informs knowledge and ways of acting. The emphasis is on being present, experiencing, perceiving, and documenting one's own knowledge and experiences, and this approach may lead to a different understanding of human beings and their place in the world, with indigenous people typically exhibiting a less hierarchical view of superiority over animal and nature. Indigenous theories and the underlying cosmologies challenge hierarchical frameworks and promote a more holistic and relational understanding of the world and human nature interactions in it. These cosmologies also emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings within an environmental system, which is often called a web of reciprocal relationships. And Kyle White describes this as relatives that have responsibility to support the conditions needed for other relatives to practice their roles within a system of relationships that produce important environmental outcomes. And this is what we will be looking at. So all actors are viewed as able to interact and influence each other, and animals and nature receive agency. These worldviews are also clearly visible in indigenous declarations, such as the Mystic Lake Declaration of 2009. And these ethics of entanglement, as GDI there calls them, promoted by indigenous understandings of nature and education, might lead us to understand culture as something nature does. In Irish fairy tales, the Irish landscape is often portrayed as a guardian, protecting its resources and upholding justice. The Dinshen Cha, Celtic animism, fairy-human environmental relations, and the motive of the otherworld, Tir na Ook, the fairyland, which is closely tied to natural spaces and phenomena, and which can be interpreted as giving agency to the reciprocity and intersubjectivity of nature, make Irish fairy tales very interesting in this context. Agency is also a crucial aspect of environmental storytelling, and traditional narrative theories tend to exclude non-human agency. But in the context of econarratology, recognizing the agency of non-human and inanimate entities allows for a more comprehensive analysis of storytelling about nature. And as I said before, I used Geerdes Julian's dry mass potential model, which many of you probably know better than I do because I've since moved on to a different area. But just so that we're all on the same page, there's basically two schema. We have the subject to object schema, and we have the sender to object to receiver schema. And while the subject to object schema is usually a narrative where a subject, the agent, performs an object on the patient or target, the sender to object to receiver schema focuses on narratives involving the transmission of something from a sender to receiver, which might be knowledge, a basic object, or even more abstract concepts. And the focus of transitivity in Greimer's model, which is based on a dualistic worldview and closely tied to anthropocentric assumptions, can be viewed as limiting when trying to move beyond the subject-object binary and explore the interconnectedness of human and non-human realities in shaping narratives and understanding the world. Because of that, considering non-human characters as actants, according to Bruno Latour's actor network theory, and incorporating this in Greimer's model, can open the way for new analyses in iconarchaeology, as we will see in my analysis. And I will now give you an overview of my analysis of the tale, The Salmon of Knowledge. And I have to mention that, sadly, I worked with translated versions of all tales, and it's obviously possible that there's information, symbolism, or stylistic devices that have been lost in the process of translation, especially since translating originally Irish fairy tales poses a great challenge because of their deep interweaving with language and culture. The Salmon of Knowledge functions as the origin tale of Fionn, the leader of the Fianna, which we will hear much more about in a moment from the actual expert on this. It tells the story of Fionn's acquisition of the world's entire knowledge, which he obtains accidentally when cooking the Salmon of Knowledge for his mentor, Finnegas. In the exposition of the tale, the Salmon of Knowledge is introduced as living in a still dark pool in the shade of the overhanging hazel trees. It was the result of eating these nuts of these magical trees that the salmon had acquired the knowledge of the world. This contrasts with the limitations of even the wisest human beings, as Finnegas is described as knowing more about the world, including the secrets of the birds and animals and plants and stars, than any other man in Ireland, while still he did not know everything. A prophecy Finnegan relates to Fionn, his student, states that whoever consumes the salmon will receive this knowledge, but it turns out later actually that the salmon doesn't need to be eaten, but that the knowledge is already transmitted when Fionn touches the fish, and because he burns his thumb, takes the fish as he places his thumb in his mouth. So we have rather a point of contact than an actual eating of the fish. As mentioned previously, the opening of the tale introduces the more than human world as having secrets, the secrets of the birds and animals, plants and stars. And here we can draw a parallel to the other world, a realm of nature beyond human control or comprehension, where the boundaries between the human realm and the spiritual realm are blurred. And the salmon, being a fish, is strongly connected to the element of water, which is frequently associated with the other world. And the magical hazelnut trees connected to the ground and water by their roots are another connection to the underground Tiana Oak. In Celtic mythology also, the hazelnut tree is often associated with wisdom and mystical knowledge, and in other versions of the tale, the connection to the fairy folk is actually confirmed directly, as you can see in this quote. The salmon has immense influence on both the human characters in the tale, as Finnegas, moving to the River Boyne, adapts a big part of his life to catching it, and Fionn's later interaction with the Salmon of Knowledge has profound impact on his life and destiny. Fionn's connection to the hazelnut, which held the knowledge before, is also evident in the fact that in later tales his shield is made from hazelwood. Without the expansion of Greimer's model using ANT, the analysis of the tale could look as follows, which is very simple. We have just different subjects performing actions on the objects. So, for example, the Salmon of Knowledge or the knowledge of the world. In this case, we can see that the salmon is considered an object without any agency or influence, but using ANT and incorporating the salmon as a non-human actor with agency, the structure becomes much more complicated and diverse. We now have, for example, a situation where previously the salmon as a subject consumes the hazelnut. We also have the transmission of the knowledge of the world to Fionn rather than just a pure consumption. So the salmon actually gives the knowledge of the world as the sender to the receiver, Fionn. But we can even incorporate the hazelnut as another non-human accent, because it previously, as an inanimate entity, transmits the knowledge of the world to the salmon. And now we actually have a chain of action that doesn't even include a human actant. So the transmitted knowledge links natural, animal, and human actants, and the acquisition, possession, and transmission of knowledge is identical for the non-human and the human characters. Fionn's interaction with the Salmon of Knowledge and the profound impact it has on his life signifies the potential for meaningful connections between human and non-human beings. And this also aligns with Celtic animistic beliefs, attributing agency and sentience to elements of the natural world, including trees, rivers, and animals. And the element of the hazelnut suggests that there is inherent knowledge and wisdom in nature itself. when the tale clearly states as well that the natural world holds secrets and insights, and these secrets are shown to be accessed by those who interact with the nature. This connects to the native science or indigenous knowledge, which, as mentioned before, centralizes observation and experiential research and knowledge acquisition. And the theme of acquiring through multi-species knowledge through multi-species interactions and entanglement align with the concept of interspecies co-evolution and Donna Haraway's concept of becoming with. According to Haraway, if we appreciate the foolishness of human exceptionalism, then we know that becoming is always becoming with. Even if that is not Fionn's own intention as he acquires the knowledge accidentally, after his interaction with the salmon, Fionn is changed completely. And to summarize, the tale shows that interactions with the modern human world and knowledge acquired through this interaction can profoundly shape a person. It furthermore shows that knowledge is not portrayed as something human-specific, but as something inherent in nature and able to cross species borders. And the non-human animal is actually portrayed as holding more knowledge than one of the wisest humans, which opposes human superiority claims. In some later tales about Fionn, he also is described as placing his thumb in his mouth when he needs to access the knowledge, which is firstly quite funny. Yeah. Imagine like a warrior, soldier, and leader sucking his thumb on the battlefield. But it also shows him returning to this point of multi-species contact when he's in search for guidance. And after this exemplary analysis, I want to present my overall findings from the analyses of the three fairy tales, Fjord Usgard and Salmon of Knowledge and the Wooing of the Chain. And although one can find certain characteristics that are overall classical for the genre of fairy tales, as for example, a strong focus on morality in Fjord Usgard, the boundaries to other narrative traditions and folklore are blurred, as typical for the Irish fairy tale. And characteristics of the explanatory tale in these fairy tales are especially visible. One prominent theme is the openness to the unknown, experience, the unsubconscious, and the interaction with the other. And water, often associated with the other world in Irish fairy tales, plays a significant role in all three narratives, symbolizing transformation and fluidity of boundaries. In their interaction with the modern human world, characters undergo physical and/or metaphysical transformations, and this highlights fluidity and interconnectedness and challenges rigid categorization. In all tales, the human characters exhibit complex relationships with nature, animal, and the other world, and non-human actors play a crucial role in the narrative. They are portrayed as having agency and sentience, and they influence the events of the stories and the human characters. The interaction between non-human and human actors shape the narratives. Knowledge and memories, in the case of the Wooing of Etain, are shown to be able to cross species borders. And multi-species entanglement highlights the interconnectedness between the actants and the narrative network. The judgment of the well and inanimate actant in the tale of Fjord Usgard, for example, connects the narrative networks directly to the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships in indigenous cosmology and suggests a parallel between the actants in the narrative and the relatives connected in this web, which hold responsibility for each other and the environmental outcomes resulting from their actions. Names also serve as powerful symbols that connect characters to the natural world, reinforcing their identities and influencing their interaction. And the connection between names, knowledge, and nature underscores the notion of a profound bond between language, cultural identity, and the forces of the natural world. All three narratives also emphasize the importance of storytelling as a means of preserving cultural heritage and connecting the past and present. The existence of multiple versions of the tales also demonstrate the dynamic nature of all storytelling and the collective authorship. Passed down through generations, these narratives reflect the resilience and resistance of Irish cultural memory against English colonial oppression of the Irish language, and cultural assimilation, as, for example, the Celtic animism and the connection to the Dinshenra are still clearly visible in the narratives, especially in the Wooing of Etain. As mentioned before, the substructure of a fairy tale is the culture of the people. And according to Columbus Opuya, myths and tales can serve as means of cultural surviving, preserving and transmitting indigenous knowledge and values and worldviews. Historical, cultural, and cognitive perspectives are very important for understanding fiction and separating it from factual narration. So narratives that one group would interpret as fiction can be read as factual by another group belonging to a different time or culture. And it's possible that elements which we interpret as fictional today were viewed as rather factual when those narratives originated. The tales also reflect a pre-Christian and pre-colonial openness to experience and interpretation. And as typical for Irish fairy tales, the narratives provide an experience and intuition-based reading of the world, which can be connected to native science. To conclude, the selected fairy tales embody a narrative transition that transcend mere entertainment. They serve as cultural repository, preserving and representing indigenous knowledge and cosmology, as well as concepts of native science. The tales highlight the interconnectedness of nature and culture and exhibit networks of actors that represent webs of reciprocal relationships. They clearly display themes of interconnectedness, transformation, experiential learning with and becoming with the more natural world. And in today's context, they can inspire and inform ecological thinking, and they can also help us explore and embrace reciprocal relationships with nature as we navigate contemporary environmental challenges. Obviously, the results from the analysis are limited to 3 selected fairy tales, and for a more conclusive study with more significant results for the overall genre of Irish fairy tales, many more tales would have to be analysed. I find it very interesting in the context of the Anthropocene, in which the nature-culture dichotomy is increasingly seen as a hindrance to science and research on climate change. And I would also be very interested in research on the parallel between Irish fairy tales and contemporary aspirations in citizen science, as well as on the influence of Irish fairy tales on students' views of nature and culture in modern education, especially since I see a beautiful connection between the tale of Kioska and the Economic Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom's work on the tragedy of the commons. And I want to finish with a quote from the British mycologist Roland Sheldrake in his book Entangled Life, which deals with fungi. As he says, our relationships with microorganisms could not be closer. As we learn more about such connections, our experience of our own bodies and our place in the world changes. We are an ecosystem that leap boundaries and transcend categories. Our eye grows out of an intricate web of relationships that we only gradually come to know. Thank you very much.
I will introduce now our second speaker. Thank you. A senior lecturer and head of the Department of Modern Irish in University College Cork. Her research interests include the Fionn cycle, the study of Irish manuscripts and Irish law poetry. She's particularly interested in the Fionn Lays narrative poems about Finn MacCool and the piano, and has published a number of studies on this topic. She's co-editor of the Gaelic Finn Tradition 2, a collection of essays on the Fionn cycle published in 2022 by Four Courts Press, and is currently working on a monograph on the poetry of the Fionn cycle.
So I'll be talking about the Fionn cycle today, and you've already gotten a taste from Juliana. The story of the salmon of knowledge belongs to that categorization, I suppose. But I'll briefly explain anyway what's meant by the Fionn cycle. It's a body of lore and narratives centred on the figure of the warrior, Fionn MacCool, and his followers, the Fianna. It's a very long, rich and diverse tradition. It consists of written texts and material collected from oral recitation, long and short texts, poetry, prose, prosimetrum, which we heard about in Catherine's talk, place name lore, and much more. So in this talk, I want to draw attention, again, like Juliana, to the Fionn cycle as an excellent source for the study of the Irish animal, both real and imaginary. So Fionn and his Fianna spent much of the time in natural surroundings, interacting with animals, both domesticated and wild. Sometimes they themselves are likened to animals, and in some cases the Fionn cycle seems to reject the absolute division of human and animal. Scholarship on the Fionn cycle has much to say about the importance of landscape and the natural world within it, but I do think the texts are taking on new resonances in the 21st century with our experiences of living in the Anthropocene, so I'll have something to say about that at the end of the paper. Now, the narratives of the Fionn cycle are obviously fictional, although some practitioners and early scholars did believe that Fionn actually existed, apparently. But of course, this has implications for what they tell us about the animal world. Now, today, my focus will mostly be on imaginary animals, but I will mention at this point, just out of interest, some work by other scholars on the Fionn cycle, which is added to our knowledge of real world human-animal interaction. So, for example, Damien McManus of TCD has written a very interesting study on hunting practices in Gaelic Ireland, drawing extensively on poems and texts from the Fionn cycle. So while the texts are obviously fantastical, it appears that they do contain quite detailed information about how hunting practices were carried out. So that study was published in the journal Edu in 2018. I'll be referencing various works. I didn't put a bibliography together, but you're welcome to email me if you're curious about anything I mention. Another person who's worked in this area is Professor Elizabeth Fitzpatrick of Galway, a geographer. She's looked at landscapes of the Fune cycle, hunting grounds in other areas, and has found that the texts and the real landscape do in fact correspond to a good degree. And again, a recent study by a woman named Sharon Arbuthnot has studied a Fune cycle poem as a source for ornithological terminology, a poem that contains a long list of bird names. So again, we see, I suppose, real ecological knowledge encoded within these very fictional poems. And that study is to be found in the book The Gaelic Tradition too, mentioned there by Camille. So that's real world information. So I return now maybe, well, place names, maybe I'll say something about place names. So Fune and the Fianna travel all over Ireland, and they appear to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the land and all the animals that inhabit it. In my abstract, I mentioned the modern English language poem by Austin Clarke, The Blackbird of Derry Cairn. It's quite a well-known poem. It was on the Leaving Cert course in Ireland for years. So it is strongly influenced by a Fune cycle poem that features Fune going on an adventure in Norway when he finds a blackbird. He deposits it in the wood of Derry Cairn. So we find this pattern or a particular animal associated with a particular spot in Ireland, elsewhere in the Fune cycle. So one example is the poem about the favourite things of Fune. It gives a long list. I'll just read out some examples. He mentions he loves the warbling of the blackbird of Lesherlee, the belling of the stag from Mawmead, the bellowing of the fawn from Glanballval, and so on. So these places are defined by the presence in them of specific animals and poems. Fune seems to sort of navigate Ireland through his knowledge of these animals. So I suppose, again, another example maybe of some level of realism as far as we know. These things match up, that the places mentioned would seem to have had these animals in them at some point in history, although of course a lot of the place names can be difficult or impossible to identify. So that's real or real-ish aspects of the cycle. Now I'm kind of moving more towards imaginary aspects. So a lot of scholars have remarked on the Fianna on their role outside of human society. So in the 1940s, Marie-Louise Siostet discussed them as heroes living outside the tribe, and Joseph Nage applied the theory of liminality to them in the 1980s. That said, they're not entirely wild. Fune McCool is typically represented as inhabiting the Hill of Allen, and he enjoys feasts and poetry and music, so the fruits of civilization, I suppose. But they do spend a lot of time in the wild interacting with animals, and in many ways they're defined by these animal interactions. Sometimes they're associated with wolves, taking on the wolf's role as apex predator, killing deer in their hundreds and thousands. But elsewhere, the hunter-huntee relationship is complicated by human-animal transformations. They're quite common in the world of the Fianna, and I'll mention some examples. So first, maybe the biography of Oisin. I think Laurent had a mention of this or a similar maybe tale in his slides. So Oisin is one of the best known characters of the Fune cycle. He features in the famous story of Tír na nÓg, but in many other tales as well and poems. So Oisin's mother is one of these. We have a lot of examples in the cycle of women who transform into deer and vice versa. Oisin's mother is one of these. There are allusions to this idea of Oisin's mother being a deer in early texts. We get the fullest version in a relatively late form, an 18th century lay called The Lore and Upbringing of Oisin. So the 18th century is relatively late, I suppose, for the Fune cycle. So what happens is the Fianna go out hunting one day, and Fune is overcome by desire for a hind. Many of the texts specify that this is an enchanted woman, and Fune fathers a child on this hind/enchanted woman. The text itself isn't actually comfortable with the situation. It's described as scandalous, I suppose, understandably. But then I think it becomes more interesting moving on. We learn that Oisin was born of this deer, but in human form. He was born among the branches and the trees, and he's reared for 7 years on his deer mother's milk and spends a total of 21 years living in the wild with his deer. It's only then when he's discovered by one of his human kin that he goes back to Fune and the Fianna. At first, he doesn't even look like a human being. He's described as a monster or an ogre or a terrible, wild, shaggy man. But it's interesting, when the hounds of the Fianna find him, they drive away the deer herd, and then Oisín states, "Oh, I'm left without a mother." So there seems to be an incompatibility here. He can either be with deer or with humans. He can't maybe be with both. That said, he retains a sense of loyalty to his dear mother and to animals throughout his life. There were other versions of the tale that describe how Oisín warns his mother when she's in danger of being killed during a hunt. So in the context of this conference, what does this tell us about animals? Of course, as a topic that has already come up, is that animal figures often maybe focus more on the human than the animal. And we can see this deer figure as symbolising the marginalised presence of women in the Fionn cycle. She sort of displaces the human mother that Oisín otherwise would have to have in his biography. But that said, we also see empathy with animals, a recognition of a certain kinship, although it doesn't seem to survive contact with broader human society. We see, as with the bears we had yesterday, maybe the experience of maternality as having features that are shared between human and animal. And it has to be said, it seems that the deer mother has been quite successful. Oisín goes on to have a wonderful heroic career among the Fianna and so forth. So that's one tale. So now I might focus on some texts where Fionn and the Fianna have interactions with domesticated or captured animals. There are so many animal references in the Fionn cycle, it's impossible to cover them all, so I was focusing on certain ones I find interesting. So generally, they're happy to hunt, kill and eat wild animals, but they're not always comfortable with the idea of capturing or domesticating animals. So we see this in the story of Fionn's favourite hunting dogs, Bran and Sciolán. They're treated nearly like human characters. They're able to communicate through their sounds. They're highly intelligent and they're deeply loved. So the tale of how Fionn acquires hounds features human-animal transformation, again with some echoes of the tale we already discussed. The version I'm referring to features in an early modern tale, the Feast of the House of Conan. So Fionn's aunt, Furna, is pregnant and with twins, and she's turned into a hound by a jealous love rival. And then she gives birth to two puppies. This forms part of a longer narrative. I won't go into it, but the magic is eventually reversed. Furna becomes human again. But Fionn says he would rather leave his cousins in dog form. He says, if I were their father, I would prefer that they remain like that than become human. So they remain dogs forevermore. Furna goes on to have 3 other sons, and then there's reference to this sort of combined interspecies family, if you will. The 2 dogs who have 3 human brothers or half brothers, maybe. So I suppose we see here that the usual maybe master-pet relationship doesn't apply with Fionn and his favourite hounds. They're more like family than friends. So that the Fianna are they're sort of working with the Fianna rather than sort of serving a purely functional purpose, although of course they're functional as well in that they help out with hunting and so on. Then another narrative that has what I think is a very interesting depiction of captive animals is a less known one named Cuillte and the Animals. It's found in different sources. I'll focus on one version, a lay that has been dated to the early 12th century. It's narrated by Cuillte Mac Ronan, one of the main characters again of the Fianna, known for his swift running. But it's Cuillte behaves in a very unhinged and destructive manner in this particular poem, something which isn't typical for him. So it's a narrative poem, 29 stanzas long, not that long for a Fionn cycle poem as it happens. So it opens with Cuillte boasting of the lively play he has instigated. What is this lively play? He's just headed. And then he speaks of his desires. He wants to let the land go to waste. He wants to inflict weeping on every household in Ireland. He wishes to burn every mill and kill in the land. So, as I said, this level of violence is sort of unusual. So his desires here seem to be kind of an attack on what we might call established society on domesticity. And as we'll see on animal husbandry, he states that he's let calves go loose to their he's let the calves of Ireland go to their cows, and he has let loose the swift horses of Ireland. So again, I wanted to check real life farming practices as a reference, and there is information on this separation of cow and calf in Fergus Kelly's book, Early Irish Farming, a very important book for the study of the Irish animal, I would say. So in medieval Ireland, calves were taken from their mothers. They were only allowed to suckle twice a day. So I suppose we find a real world agricultural practice referenced to here. So Coillte seems to be breaking down the normal practices of farmers. He's releasing the horses, letting the calves go back to their mothers as they probably desire. Then he goes to the residence of Cormac MacCart, King of Ireland, where he causes chaos again. He sneaks in and tricks everyone, and he gives the wife of one man to another man, and he gives the wife of the king to another man, and all of this sort of troublemaking. And he recounts all of this very casually, and then we find out that Fionn has been taken captive by Cormac MacCart, so that's probably the reason for his fury. But that said, his response seems to be a bit over the top, causing all of Ireland's suffering for one kidnapping. So then Cormac sets Coillte what appears to be an impossible task. If he wants Fionn to be set free, he needs to provide pairs of animals from all over Ireland. And again, we find this kind of pairing of place and animals. So there's a long list. I'll just read a couple. So 2 stags from High Eithne, 2 blackbirds from Letted, Luncharig, 2 wrens from Dulnifa, 2 dogheads from Corrifa, 2 trusks from the Rigochos, 2 turtle doves from Dovros, and so on. There's a big long of animal plus place. So Coillte undergoes a task. It's not easy for him. He's shown as struggling, but he manages it. I think there's an interesting quatrain where he describes his capturing of the crane, and we feel that maybe he has a certain empathy or feeling for the animals he's chasing. He states, quoting, "I caught the crane by the neck, though she did not like it, she came and I brought her with me under my control to ransom." So again, he seems to feel for this crane who doesn't maybe enjoy the experience of being captured. So the poem ends rather suddenly, but it seems that Coillte is successful and that Fionn is set free. There is a longer version that gives us more information. This is actually in Scotland in the 16th century book of the Dean of Lismore. Something else to consider with the Fionn cycle. It also belongs to Scotland, and we find Scottish landscapes in there as well. So that's another angle. This version anyway gives a more complete ending. King Cormac is castigated. He's criticised for his desire to acquire the captured animals. The poem reads, quote, "Cormac had no joy of them to see them gathered side by side." So his desire for this sort of menagerie of animals just depicted as something futile, something silly. And then once Fionn is rescued, they actually manage to escape and they go back, I suppose, to their home places. So again, the whole quest is sort of shown to be a sort of a futile attempt at mastery of wild animals. Of course, this idea of pairs of animals brings the story of Noah's Ark to mind. It was probably an influence. Coillte maybe could be seen, or maybe Cormac as a sort of an anti-Noah, gathering animals together, not for a good reason, but for a sort of a mad reason. I just think it's interesting because the Fianna are very much outside society in this particular text, and Coillte seems to be far more in tune with the animals than with all the humans that he has sort of treated quite badly. Again, it's not specified if the pairs are breeding animals, but I think that's probably implied. So in this regard, it's worth thinking back to the section where Coillte swaps human partners, husbands and wives. He's sort of treating humans here as breeding pairs, like a farmer might do with animals. So I think there's a deliberate sort of a comparison there. So it's quite an extreme tale. The Fianna aren't usually that violent, but I think it's interesting how they're presented as being aligned with animals. Now, we don't know who composed this poem. Nearly all of the poems are anonymous. Whoever they were, we can assume that they enjoyed the products of farming, dairy, meat, other animal-derived goods. They were likely happy with the status quo. I don't think this is a sort of a critique of farming, the social order per se, but maybe rather an example of thinking about animals and the artificiality of farming, an attempt to see the world through not through human eyes, but through those of creatures whose interests may not always be aligned with ours, who have their own inherent existence independently of the human world. So while it is a disturbing poem, with sort of implications of sexual violence, that the poet's level of imagination is impressive. So there is sort of thought about animals within this poem, I believe. So again, as I said, there are many more animals in the Fionn cycle. They're all over the place. But certainly I would suggest if you're interested in putting together a reading list on the Irish animal, the Fionn cycle is worth taking a look at. I put up some text there that are reasonably accessible in the translation, but provide translations if people are interested. So now I'll turn briefly to a separate but related issue, the way we read these animal texts during the current ecological crisis. So Fionn's world is teeming with animals, and wild places. That said, they're always thought of having taken place centuries before the time of composition, so we can't take them too literally. And of course, land has long been an area of contention in Ireland, and even medieval petty kings didn't have such free access to the land as Fionn McCool and his Fianna, let alone people of lower classes. So there's always an element of fantasy in this control, and not really control, but sort of freedom to roam the land. So we have to be critical. We can't just see these texts as representing some long lost Eden. That wouldn't really be satisfactory. That said, their depiction of a lush natural world is striking and beautiful and inspiring. And I think it does inspire something of a feeling of eco-angst to the modern reader when we're becoming very aware of the ecological depletion of the world. And Ireland especially, I suppose, growing up, we were always told Ireland was green, but actually it turns out it's one of the most ecologically depleted countries in Europe. So it's literally green, but maybe not figuratively green. And even a lot of the landscapes we praise for their natural beauty have actually been profoundly transformed by human practices. So I'm inspired here, especially by Padraig Fogarty's book, Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature, where he gives a lot of details on different animal species and how they've been depleted over the centuries. Again, I suppose the sheep that I suppose could be taken as symbolising this. They're very beloved of our tourists board. They're one thing that stands out to tourists in Ireland, but they do cause a lot of devastation. They prevent plant growth and so on. So maybe they're not as innocent as we've been led to believe. So again, specifically with reference to the fuel cycle, again, because there are so many fuel cycle landscapes all over Ireland, many of them have been damaged. So this is the Hill of Allen as it stands today, so you can see it's quite badly destroyed one side of it by this mining operation. And again, another place where Fionn goes hunting a lot would be around Killarney, on the lakes of Killarney. So where Killarney National Park is today. So again, it's not as fun a place as you would think. Just trying to get this to show properly. There's been a lot of discussion of this park in the news recently. There are a lot of problems with the invasive species of rhododendron, which is preventing the growth of other plants. And then there is a problem of the over reproduction of deer as well. There are too many deer, and there are a lot of problems with this park as well. So it'd be naive to think that this wildlife park represents anything really close to what people might have experienced in the past, and that we find indirectly in the Fionn cycle. So I'm not suggesting we should aim to recreate the landscapes of Fionn. It would be impossible and not necessarily desirable. However, I do think it's interesting to read these texts in conjunction with reading Ireland's landscapes, past, present, and maybe into the future. So George Monbiot, in his book Feral, Rewilding the Land, Sea and Human Life, evokes a sense of lots of wilderness he feels in the world, and I think we do find a sense of this wilderness in the Fionn cycle, indirectly, not to take it too literally, but you can clearly a lot of the people who composed the text did have a level of experience that probably few people, if any, would have today. Again, another point that Monbiot discusses in that book is the idea of the shifting baseline. Our generation thinks that nature, as it was when they were children, is the correct state, and that any depletion is a sort of a loss. But maybe they don't realise that if you went back multiple generations, the level of depletion is a lot greater. It's harder to imagine. It's difficult to imagine these things. And so again, I think we can get a sense of that reading the Fionn cycle. Another writer that springs to mind is the Icelandic ecological writer Andri Snare Magnusson. He's written a book on time and water, where he writes very touchingly, again, on our need to sort of think on a wider expanse of time, not just our generation and our grandparents, children, grandchildren, whatever, but to sort of see the bigger picture. Again, I think these older texts can be part of that process, maybe. So yes, I think we can get a sense of wildness through reading texts of the Fionn cycle and other texts, of course, and these can inspire us to ponder what could be done in the future. Do we want to return some of that to the world? How might that be done? However it's done, it'll be quite different to what we've had in the past, but worth thinking about. So to conclude, the Fionn cycle tales and poems are composed mostly for entertainment, really. In most cases, that would be their primary purpose. But I do believe that they contain deep thinking about animals, some expressing the alterity of animals, others exploring interspecies commonalities, always thought-provoking. So there are historical, philosophical, and literary interest, and also in this time of ecological crisis, we can't help but relate them to our own increasingly narrow experiences of the natural and animal world. So in that sense, I think they do speak to us louder than ever. So perhaps we should all go and listen to the song of the Blackbird of Jerry Kearns. Thank you.
Thank you for another amazing talk. So the last speaker is Klara Vitsani-Rudkova, PhD candidate in the Center for Irish Studies, Department of Anglophone Literature and Culture at Charles University in Prague. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on the theatre of Marina Carr and the cultural heritage of ancient Greece. Other research interests include women prose writers and Irish folklore. Klara received a master's degree in Irish Studies from Charles University in 2021 and an undergraduate degree in Ancient History from the University of Edinburgh in 2015. She was a visiting student at University College Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, Université de Bourgogne. She has also presented at international conferences and is a member of the editorial board of the student journal The Protagonist and editorial assistant of the Literaria Pragensia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you, Cami, for the amazing pronunciation. That's actually very impressive. I also want to thank the organizers and the student assistants. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to be able to be here. A little bit about this paper. It came out of some research that I did at the National Folklore Collection Archive, stored at UCD in Dublin. It's an amazing collection. I'm sure most of you have interacted with it, but I was really impressed by how it works on site. Really grateful to the archivists and the professors there who kind of helped me navigate it. As I said, I'm also very sad I couldn't read the Irish language bits and volumes. It eventually didn't really fit my thesis, but this symposium seemed really great at kind of being in line with the material that I came across there, or some of it. So that's the backstory. I'm also glad for Juliana's paper on the salmon, because that's one bit that I wasn't able to elaborate on, so that's great. All right. So this paper investigates the symbolism behind Marina Carr's use of animals, especially the swan and the cat, in her Midlands trilogy. These tragedies were first produced in the 1990s at the Abbey Theatre, the Irish National Theatre, with the May and the Portia Coughlin premiering on the smaller Peacock stage, and By the Book of Cats on the Abbey main stage. So that's kind of Carr's breakthrough play, we could say. They have been revived and reproduced many times, perhaps most notably for my purposes in relation to the Abbey. By the Book of Cats, no, I don't want to mix them up. By the Book of Cats was revived in 2015 at the Abbey, and Portia Coughlin in 2022. So very recently, both on the main stage this time. There was also a London production of Portia Coughlin last year that I have just come across. So still kind of with us. So all of these plays, they're a trilogy, not in terms of the narrative, as is often the case, I suppose, with trilogies, but they are all set in a landscape that's heavily inspired by Marina Carr's home in County Offaly, or childhood home, I should say. She's been based in Dublin for a long time now. She grew up in the rural area near the city of Tullamore, more specifically the Palace Lake. And many of the elements of that landscape are to be found in the Midlands play. Swans, a bogland, a lake, and also a former traveller halting site, which is one of the themes in the plays as well. All of them present heroines trapped in different circumstances, and all of them take their lives in the course of the play or plays. The three tragedies are highly intertextual, as Carr's theatre is in general. And here she combines references to the Western canon generally since the antiquity until more recently, but also importantly to Irish folklore. And the Midlands accent is very important there as well. It's very heavy. In the productions that I've seen, it's that's how the actors actually speak. I'm not going to do it when I'm quoting from the play. And most importantly, animals. So specialist ones and cats in the Midlands plays, or the Midlands trilogy more specifically. There's another Midlands play on Raftery's Hill that I'm not discussing. They have a symbolic significance mostly, which is something that I have kind of come to think about in a different light after listening to the talks yesterday. So this has been very inspiring. And they are all tied to the bodies of water that are central to the landscape in these plays. And all of this is contextualized in this paper by referring to the partly to classical scholarship, but most importantly to Irish folklore. And as I said, it draws on the National Folklore Collection, specifically the main manuscript collection. So let's start with Páirse Caghalan. So in Páirse Caghalan, animals probably have the least significance because there's this symbolism of human twins that probably looms the largest over the narrative and Páirse's psyche, Páirse being the heroine. She's traumatized by her twin brother Gabriel's death that had occurred 15 years prior. She's 30 now, so we also have this 15 plus 15 kind of symbolism, and she does take her life in the course of the play. So she's haunted by this trauma. But a second large thing that permeates the Midlands plays generally is the rural social organization where women are expected to be mothers and men, ideally, to own farmland. Páirse grew up as a farmer's daughter, and she married into the neighboring land, which has this kind of uncanny quality to it, as the father can kind of see what she's doing and kind of keep control over her because he's just on the neighboring land. But there's also this metaphor, I think, of moving between pens, almost like a farm animal, because that seems to be how she feels. She has this really strong sense of entrapment in the social order. For her, the nearby Belmont River is a place of escape and refuge. It's named after a local woman that had been killed there ages ago. And to her, it represents both freedom and femininity. And that's where the animals are to be found as well. So when she's asked to take a holiday to feel better, she retorts, I'm sure I'd live through what other folks call holidays, but my mind would be turning on the Belmont River. Would be wondering, was it flowing rough or smooth? Was the bank mucky or dry? Was the salmon beginning to roaring for the sea? Was the frogs spawning the water lilies? Had the heron returned? Would be wondering all of these and 1,000 other wonderings. That river washes over me. So importantly, I think, unlike the farm animals, these ones are free to roam. Perhaps the frogs stick closer to the river in a similar way as Páirse does for security to her home. But the salmon and the heron, they're free to go, and they're importantly free to return when they want to, which is something that she cannot do or imagine to do. It's hard to say. So moving on to the May, the second play in the trilogy, or the first one in terms of chronology. Again, it's called After the Heron, so the May, the heroine. She lives on a lake. It's modeled, I think, on the Palace Lake, but it's called the Owl Lake. She lives there with her children. There's this Odyssean background, or has been suggested that, like Penelope waiting for Odysseus, she's waiting for her wandering husband, who finally returns, which is an unexpected kind of point in the narrative. And he explains it's because of a prophetic dream that he had, in which he saw his wife's coffin, to quote, in a carriage drawn by 2 black swans, end of quote. And it's interesting that there are, and it seems that there are regular white swans living on the lake, both the actual Palace Lake and the Owl Lake, but those omens are black swans. They don't really appear in the narrative itself, but they're important for this prophetic dream that turns to be true. Robert remembers that the swans take his wife, quote, over a dark expanse of water, end of quote, and he can't reach them, although he's running after them, he's shouting that he can't get to her. So this, I think, gives the swans, this black swans, this liminal quality, and that kind of carries over into By the Book of Cats, with which I'll be spending most of my time now, because that their animals have the most prominence, although again, they're used in a symbolic manner. So, By the Book of Cats opens with, this time it's not called after the heroine, with the heroine Hester dragging a dead black swan. We know its name, it's called Blackwing, across the stage, and we soon learn, as she learns from the local wise woman called Catwoman, that her life is tied to that of the swan. So again, it's a death omen, again, at the very beginning of the play. In terms of the overall structure of the play, there's this strong combination of Irish folklore and the Greek literary tradition, because By the Book of Cats is an adaptation of the Greek tragedy Medea, whereas the other Midlands plays just reference some of the ancient sources and tradition. This is an adaptation, although it took the critics a while at the very beginning to identify that source text. But it's transposed into the Midlands of the 1990s with the landscape and the accent kind of very in tune with the other Midlands plays. In terms of scholarship, I've noticed that the prominence of swans there is mentioned, but it's usually, that's done just in passing, and there's usually a reference to the Children of the Lear legend, which is very well known. But I've come across only one source that has really done an in-depth analysis in terms of the folklore references, and that's Eric Michael McKinney's PhD thesis called Resurrections, the Use of Folklore Themes and Motifs in Marina Carter's works, defended in 2008. And he devotes 16 pages to this play specifically, but I have found some themes that he does not discuss, namely the melting legend and the Caliph figure, which are tied to animals and will be discussed next. Okay, good. In terms of the storyline, both the original and in this version, Medea, it stages the tragic story of an otherworld female figure and a child murderess. She's this barbarian princess and sorceress who comes from Colchis in the Black Sea region, so way to the east for the Greeks. And so she embodies these two key ancient stereotypes, the female and the Oriental. So she's this other figure. And the play opens with her impending banishment, which is clearly undeserved. And it comes about as the result of her husband or her partner, Jason the Argonaut's choice to make a more profitable match to the local princess. So they're both refugees in the city of Corinth, and Medea is kind of getting the short stick and just being kicked out through no fault of her own. So perhaps not too surprisingly, the tragedy ends with Medea murdering most of the wedding party, but also her children, which is the heavy bit for most critics and people probably. Carr does adapt most of the narrative. She changes the name. So Jason becomes Carthage Gilbride, Medea becomes Hester Swain, which I'll discuss in a moment. They're informally engaged but not married, and they have one child, this time a daughter called Josie. Hester doesn't murder Carthage's new bride, Caroline Cassidy. Instead, he marries her in the course of the play, and Hester's rage is limited to burning down their farm. So she actually kills the animals, not the people, in this version. And she disrupts the wedding ceremony. Her plan is to next commit suicide, but she's her daughter finds her at the last minute, and through the combination of Hester's own trauma of parental abandonment, she made this spur of a moment decision to kill Josie as well, with this emotion of taking her with her, not leaving her behind. So this has often been interpreted more as a kind of maternal act, although of course it's infanticide. Okay, so importantly, Hester is of Irish traveller descent in this version, and that has determined her marginal place in the community. Unlike Medea, who had moved to Corinth, Hester has grown up in the local area, so she should be treated as a local woman, we would think, but she's also this other. And importantly, I think McKenna argues that there isn't a unified folklore backdrop to okay, that's one too late. Lots of travelers and unified backdrop. He explains, while there is enough realism in the May and Portia Coughlin for the folkloric elements, the Owl Lake myth and the Belmont River, to stand out in such an obvious way that all the other non-realistic images are easily connected to them, realism in By the Book of Cats is only present in a vaporous way. Thus, the many folkloric and non-realistic elements seem less unified in their presence. So my argument here is that if we look at the figure of the Cailleach, which here is closely tied to animals, we might find that unifying element to the folklore elements there. So as Gerard O'Crollach explains in his book of the Cailleach, Stories of the Wise Woman Healer, we have, roughly speaking, these two traditions, apologies for, of the Cailleach. In the older, with the mythology, we can think of Macha, for example. We have this sovereignty goddess Humaris, more recent versions. We have the old wise woman living on the margins of a community. So my argument here is that Hester is this older version of the Cailleach, and that also overlaps with the Melusine legend, as I will show. Cailleach is always tied to the local landscape to an extent, and it's important that Hester probably referring to Hawthorne's novel. So Hester's surname is Swain, which apparently is the vernacular for swan. So she's tied to that animal. And I don't find the Children of the Lear legend particularly convincing. Just to summarize, a jealous stepmother transforms her children that she has by the local chieftain Lear into swans, after which they must roam watery areas of Ireland for centuries. Different versions, different watery areas. They are eventually released upon the arrival into Ireland of St. Patrick or St. Brendan, and they die soon after. So in a narrative sense, I think there is little to connect this legend to Hester's narrative, but the sense of entrapment is certainly there in the Midlands plays, and generally cases there. So I'm going to turn to Catwoman now, this other Cailleach figure type. She's tied much more strongly to the landscape, which is also common for this Cailleach type, through her association with cats. So we don't know how that came about. We know that the area is called the Bog of Cats and that this human-like creature is called Catwoman. All we know is what we learned from her when she says, I know everything that happens on this bog. I'm the keeper of the Bog of Cats. I own this bog. She is said to live in, quote, a little house of turf surrounded by 100-odd mousetraps. So she's this human, more human than animal creature. She lives on the margins of the local community, but she's also its respected member. And interestingly, her friendship with the local priest kind of symbolizes a union of the pagan and the Christian in the local area from the more recent production. How am I doing with time?
It's been 20 minutes, but I mean,
already.
Just when you ask.
Okay,
but I mean,
fine.
I take your time to finish.
Okay, reading clearly is way faster. All right, so let's read a little bit now. So Catwoman's liminal nature, both within and outside of civilization, ties in with various beliefs held in Ireland about cats. The National Folklore Commission collected some material on the topic. Volume 1403 in the main manuscript collection containing the largest portion that's devoted to folk beliefs in cats. I have found surprisingly little on swans, actually. So in general, cats are believed to be the descendants of tigers, but of course in some traditions, that have lived in Ireland since, quote, ancient times. And, quote, the yellow ashy cats were believed to be left behind by the Danes or other Scandinavians. According to the informant Thomas Gormley, quote, there was a real thought of the cat long ago. Wild cats were believed to have roamed Ireland in the past, and some accounts feature attacks with people. In one story, a man is saved from wild cats in the woods when his own cat intervenes. In another, 1,000 cats organize themselves to carry away the body of a cat that had been killed by a local boy. In interviews in volume 1403, cats are generally regarded as untrustworthy or even dangerous, but they're commonly kept because they catch mice, so they're practical. Traditionally, there are many interesting traditions around them and habits. People would put their cat outside of the house before saying prayers, apparently. That's mostly counties Cavan and Meath, and just a few informants, but that's the most material that we have. Some people would believe that there was, quote, a drop of the devil in the cat. They would also be kept away from a wake. And people would sometimes wait a few days before bringing their cat along when they're moving house. Seeing a black cat used to be believed lucky, with a cat that had crossed the path of a corpse being a bad omen. And they were often used in weather divination, and the fur was believed to have healing powers. So this is quite in tune with Car's Catwoman, who lives on the margins of the community, but despite her strangeness, she's invited to the wedding to bring good luck, and she possesses prophetic powers. So I'm going to skip over a little bit, but just to go back to the former Caliph discussed to Hester, there is a lot that suggests a connection with the Irish Melusine legend versions, where in tune with that tradition of the Caliph, she marries a local man, but eventually the bond is broken, and the woman returns either to the other world or she's trapped in between. And interestingly, animals are often important. So in one version, there's this entrapment where the fairy wife turns herself into a swan and the children into cygnets, and then they're trapped on the lake by the chieftain's castle, kind of trapped in between worlds. So in general, I would say that through this animal symbolism, we can talk about these different Melusine legend and Caliph figure traditions existing in the play, which overall I think further helps interpret the death of Hester and her daughter as more of an escape than in just a murder or a suicide. And in general, with the other Midlands plays discussed, we can see that animals are tied with freedom and escape, which stands in opposition to the sense of entrapment that the female heroines are experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've got until 4:30 for questions. Without further ado, then the floor is open for questions.
Yes, first of all, thank you for your great talks, all of you. I have the question to all of you, but I think more to Juliana and Clara. Juliana, in particular, you mentioned water as kind of transformation, and also in your talk, Clara, water played a big role, like grass, lakes, and rivers, and people or beings living in between country or being outside of water or inside of water. What role would you say does water play in the text you mentioned? Well,
go first if you want. So I think for me it's a little bit particular because I just focus on one of the 3 fairy tales now. But I think the role of water is the strongest in the Wooing Up. I'm struggling so much with this because we actually have the character like coming in contact with water, so she's transformed by a jealous ex-wife of her lover, from a fairy of Tionok to sometimes a butterfly, sometimes a fly, which falls into the cup of a woman who drinks it up, and then she is actually pregnant with a baby that still has connections to the fairy and the butterfly of like being golden hair that the butterfly was, and like she used to be in Tionok as well. And she can remember all of her memories. They come back to her when she's like confronted by some poetry that revolves around her. And I think there it's just clearly she's like the water just makes all of those borders between the modern human world, which is maybe the fairy world, maybe the animal world, and maybe then the human world. It just makes them disappear because she's literally going from one species to the other. While the important things of like the stories, the memories, and the knowledge, they actually stay with her while she's. So I think it's just very much like the transformation and fluidity there. And since the water is anyway tied to the underground, you know, you have this connection to the other world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I found as well, that actually the escape of the other world fairy wife or the that other world woman often happens through a well or a lake or the sea, often in the mermaid and fisherman type. So there seems to be the potential of the bodies of water to be portals, basically. And then in Carr's plays, I think, especially in the Midlands play, there's this matrilineal, Melissa Seher, who's a big scholar on Carr, speaks of this matrilineal landscape where water serves this purpose of feminizing also the landscape.
Yeah, thank you all three for your papers. And my question kind of picks up on that, the matrilineal line. And you showed very convincingly this kind of the web of references, especially also to earlier female figures in Carr's plays. And I wondered actually about the names of the two other female protagonists, Portia and Hester, both of which are very prominent names also in not necessarily Irish literature, but Portia in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Hester in The Scarlet Letter. So I wondered if, you know, apart from the Emmons, apart from the Irish, whether there's more, or whether this kind of matrilineal line also covers a wider, even wider web of references, the intertextual references.
I think so. I also, for my research in Marina Carr's archive in the National Library in Dublin, it seems that she had this phase of a year at least where she just kept reading on what she considered to be the basic stuff that she needs to know as a playwright. And I think in the Midlands trilogy that came soon after, it's really clear that she's full of this material. And I think it kind of goes away later on where she either writes her own plays or adaptations of like her own, like creates completely new narratives, or she adapts a specific play or specific novel. And I think the Midlands plays are just these, like, there are so many different references, and certainly Portia has been linked to The Merchant of Venice. With the May, it's not sure. Some people have suggested that it has this Celtic chieftain kind of element because of the use of the definite article, which I don't know if that's actually someone would argue against that. That's something I've come across, and that she's this chieftain figure. And with Hester, yeah, it's Hester Bryn probably, because she's also an outcast.
And kind of both of them being trapped in the patriarchal societies in their different ways. But
again, yes, thank you for the panel, and kind of maybe picking up on you. I just was asking you all how much you're aware of, especially maybe the first two speakers, and then I have a suggestion for Clara. But you know, around the turn of the 20th century, and I think up until current times, like women writers in Ireland are trying to kind of make sure that in the, you know, the kind of the revival of the Finn cycle, you know, for nationalist purposes, you know, around the turn of the century, really focused on male warriors. And people like Alice Milligan and Ava Gore Booth and Constance Markovich, you know, were making sure that we didn't forget about Queen Maeve and female warriors, and like the Morrigan, who like really were frustrating the warriors in various ways. And we see this kind of, I think, persisting into 20th century Irish women's writing, especially, and I'm wondering, maybe especially Juliana, if you're aware of Eilish the Great, who she's trained as a folklorist. She has a degree from UCD in folklore, but she's a novelist, short story writer, and she has several collections of short stories where she interweaves, and especially focusing on animals, interweaves like ancient Irish and even sometimes made up legends into like very contemporary narratives. So, I mean, I suppose that's more of an observation than anything, but I just think it's interesting, you know, kind of coming off of what you're saying about the patriarchy, because I would have a suggestion for maybe a possible parallel between The Children of Lear and By the Bog of Cats, whether it persuades you or not, because in all those plays, one of the themes is intergenerational conflict and competition between women, which patriarchy encourages. You know, I mean, it's you know, it's very, very creepy in gap between Carthage and his mother. You know, she's trying to be the bride, you know, she's there in her bridal gown at the wedding, you know. And of course, the children of Lear, why they're made into swans is because their stepmother, Aoife, does not want to compete with them. So she turns them into swans. So, I mean, it's a quite very parallel, but I would suggest that maybe that's a possible way of thinking about it as informing on some level, informing the themes, maybe even of the whole trilogy.
I think
that swans come into, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does, tying it to Hester through that parallel with Swan, that wasn't working for me.
Yeah.
It just seemed that that's not what her relationship with Josie was.
Yeah.
About, but yeah, I think, and that's interesting with Mrs. Kilbride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, even to an extent, you know, Caroline and even Hester are kind of different generations, really. I mean, Hester used to babysit for.
Oh, actually, that's really
For
interesting.
Caroline, and this is all for all the trilogy. There's this constant like jockeying for position between grandmothers and granddaughters and mothers and daughters. Like it's a theme that runs very powerfully throughout. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Hi, I've got a kind of broad, thank you for these shape-shifting question. I'm always troubled by and it was for all of you, but I also wanted to ask a specific question about Finn, your great Finn contribution. So the shapeshifters, you know, quite often it seems like in the stories like Selkies, they get sort of trapped on one side, right? It seems like the preferable side to be on is the human side, and you get your skin confiscated and you can't go back to the elements. It's always sort of trapped, and it's a human-animal binary that it seems like it's, why is the difficulty of being able to go back and forth between, right? That's a troubling idea. But I was thinking, and when you were describing the Finn cycle, that somehow he doesn't forget the deer. He doesn't forget the deer mother, which when I think about, I'm thinking like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. I don't know if that's a bizarre connection to have made, but Enkidu is very happy with the animals. He gets kind of commandeered by and lured into human society by Gilgamesh and his mother, and he loses contact, and that's the source of all kinds of tragedy later on in that early ancient story. So, but it seemed to me like in the Finn cycle, at least there was he doesn't forget. What you said was he doesn't forget the mother, and so I guess it's a broader question about the shapeshifter, right, and the role of the shapeshifter, and I guess you know, maybe one way to think about the shapeshifter, I've heard it described as, oh, well, if you want to go back to the animal world, then that's not individuation and that's not becoming fully human. But I think the source of enchantment in the shapeshifter is the ability to go back and forth, right, between the animal and the human. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or if that made some sense, but it's just, I've been thinking about shapeshifter figures for a while and wondering about them.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll look into that Gilgamesh reference. Yeah, well, I mean, there's obviously shapeshifting all over Irish literature, and there's so many different circumstances. But it's always sort of constrained. You maybe have one shift or two, but not that many. It's
right.
So there's something there. You kind of have to make your choice, and sometimes you have a choice, or sometimes you're shape-shifted, and somebody else shifts you into yeah. So. Yeah, Oisin is kind of a rare character where he seems to a certain point, he sort of overcomes that limitation, manages to keep something. And as I said, the text I was talking about, it's not one of the better known ones. But I suppose it's interesting to think of it in its wider representation. You know, he's also the one who, he does have something different. He's the one who survived. All the rest of them die, and he goes on to Tirnanoke, he comes back, he meets St. Patrick. He obviously has something. Yeah. He has this kind of adaptability. So again, so you don't have one biographical tale. You have, for Fionn McCool, you have sort of, well, there's the Boyhood Deeds, which has a lot of his life and childhood. With Oisin, there's kind of bits all over the place. So I don't think we've really fully kind of integrated
all the lore to form a picture of this character, but I would sort of think that there's something fundamental in that sort of childhood he had in the wild.
Yeah.
And again, that maybe needs to be looked at more, that sort of gives him some sort of, I don't know, flexibility or durability that he can kind of go through all these different shifts and sort of still come out, you know. And he's the one who preserves all the lore as well. So the idea is that he's telling St. Patrick about the Fianna. If it wasn't for him, it would be gone. He's really the one who creates it in a sense, you know. So, but it all comes from a deer, so there's something there.
Yeah. Maybe if I can just comment on that, I think for me that because there was some shape shifting in the Melusine legends with the mermaid for sure, and when she doesn't have her tail or her comb is taken away by the husband, then she can't shape. But even in the other ones where she is there voluntarily, so there's no item stealing, it seems to be the children and the partner that are kind of keeping her in this world. And when she decides to or has to return, she's confronted with the question of what to do with the children and how to take them with her. And that's usually the issue with the Doubt Stones, for example, version, leading to the children being transformed into rocks on the shore and her escaping alone, for example.
Thank you very much. I've been told some of you have brains to catch. You know, able to end the session on time. So thank you so much for a wonderful informative session. And I think we can go on a well-deserved break or
Yes.
Words. So, yeah, thanks again.
Break for the three.